Well, good morning, everyone. We're just getting a few more people coming into the Zoom call and the webinar, so we'll get started in a minute or so. So good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Colin Scott. I'm Vice President for Equality, Diversity, Inclusion here at UCD, and I'm delighted to welcome you to UCD's International Women's Day event, Bridging the Gender Gap, Research and Responses to COVID-19, featuring two presentations from outstanding researchers working to better understand the impact of the pandemic for gender. Before we get started, I wish to let you know that we are recording this session so we can make it available to those unable to attend live. We encourage you to tweet about this webinar by using the Twitter handle @UCD_EDI and the hashtag IWD2021. Very importantly, you can ask questions at any time by pressing on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to type in your questions while speakers are presenting. This allows us to get through more questions during the time, and we will take the questions at the end of each of the two talks that we're going to have this morning. So International Women's Day is a day of recognition and celebration of the achievements of women, but it's also a day to acknowledge and to recommit our efforts to tackle inequality on gender grounds, which remains a big challenge everywhere, not least in Ireland, whether measured in terms of gender pay gap, incidents of gender-based violence, or the numerous other ways in which equality is denied to women. Gender equality is not simply a burning issue of social justice, it's also concerned with ensuring we do not squander talent. The slogan for International Women's Day this year is "Choose to Challenge," and I find this really resonant. It's nearly 8 years ago now that I witnessed three really egregious examples of gender inequality in UCD, our university, and at bursting point hit reply all from a mere head of school to the president, the entire senior management team, and extended leadership group. I do not normally hit reply all, and thought my rage and impatience might end my short leadership career. In retrospect, that is the moment I chose to challenge and started a new aspect to my career in equality work in the university, subsequently chairing both the newly established UMT EDI group since 2015 and also the organisation and culture subgroup in the first institutional Athena SWAN self-assessment team. I'm probably preaching to the choir here when I encourage you all to choose to challenge and to be aware that gender equality is not simply an issue for women, it's an issue for everyone seeking a just society and equal opportunities to fulfil potential and to realise ambitions for all in contributing to a better society. We had a timely reminder today from the Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, Sinead Gibney, on social media. She said, "Let's all choose to challenge our privilege and ensure that the gender equality we work towards is an inclusive one, which brings all women together, trans women, traveller women, women of colour, women with disabilities, women of all classes, migrant women." Here at UCD, at an institutional level, we are addressing barriers to gender equality, and a core focus has been participation in the Athena SWAN programme. The university achieved bronze recognition in 2017, and this was renewed in September 2020. 14 of our 36 schools, including all 6 schools in the College of Engineering and Architecture, assessed together, now have bronze accreditation, with expectations that a further 9 will submit this year. Bronze recognition indicates having the data and doing the analysis to understand our challenges, and with a credible gender equality action plan. At UCD, we implemented many changes under the last plan and now have a new plan in place being overseen by the Gender Equality Action Group. New measures already underway are targeted in particular at further shifting the organisational culture towards greater equality and inclusion, and they include a gender review of the faculty promotions process, further development of resources and supports, a review of our dignity and respect policies, including a new policy on sexual misconduct and a supporting framework to enable cultural change, a review of the head of school appointment process, review of recruitment practices, and a review of the implementation of the gender identity and expression policy and guidelines with students and staff. And finally, the establishment of a race and ethnicity working group engaging across our community to better understand challenges and develop an action plan to address racism. We're not complacent, and there is much to do. Since 2015, our colleague, Professor Orla Feely, Vice President for Research, Innovation and Impact at UCD, has shown remarkable commitment and leadership as chair of the Athena SWAN self-assessment team and of the Gender Equality Action Group. And following the renewal of bronze accreditation last year, she's standing down from this role, and I wish to thank her for her outstanding service in advancing gender equality at UCD. Coming to today's event, while UCD continues to progress its gender equality and inclusion actions, we're cognizant that we are at the beginning of understanding the long-term impact of COVID-19 on gender equality and inclusion. Research suggests that women's voices and research are not at the centre of the response of COVID-19 due to existing gendered inequities, which have been exacerbated during this period. A year on from UCD moving to remote working, this webinar takes stock of the impacts of COVID-19 on gender equality and how the university can continue to adapt and support women during this period to continue to thrive in their careers. So I'm delighted we have with us today two outstanding researchers who will share their research with us to better inform our understanding and our needs for action. Our first speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Chrissy Ginther Saru, who's an economist at the Faculty of Economics, University of Cambridge. She's a reader in macroeconomics and finance and a research fellow of the Centre for Economic Policy Research. She's recently become interested in the gender gap of academic economists and is part of the team of Project CAPER, which tracks research output in economics in order to quantify the effects of the pandemic containment measures on economists' research activity by gender and seniority. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ginther Saru for her presentation today on findings from research on gender and COVID-19, the unequal effects of COVID-19 on economists' research productivity. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And let me share my slides first. I hope you can all see this fine and I can get going. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege, I think, to be here and talk about this research that started a little bit less than a year ago, let's say. The general project, we call it COVID-19 and academic productivity in economic research. We have some kind of small project already out. We had a column out explaining some first results on our research. It's work done together with a strong team of 4 women, which is a new experience also for me. I haven't had ever the opportunity to do research only with women, so it's been different and wonderful in many ways. And let me tell you a little bit about the background of how this started. So as a general motivation, I think is no surprise for anyone by now that there's been a very big downturn and dramatic declines in economic activity due to the pandemic around the world. It's been seen everywhere across many countries and in all facets. But what is really striking and what has been different in many ways compared to past recessions is that it has affected women a lot. And that's something that is across everything, not just academia, obviously, that we talk about here today, but a very, very striking feature of the current recessions across the world is that compared to recessions that we have had the last 50 years, mostly it has been women that have lost jobs. The unemployment rates for women have increased a lot. And in the past, it was mostly men. And importantly, the gap between unemployment rates of women relative to men is much, much bigger than gaps of previous recessions. And I've just throwing in here a few clippings from different articles and sources that, you know, if you Google she-cession, that is the word that is used a lot these days to capture this effect, you find tons of things. And in fact, this is kind of the most recent one, is about a week ago, talking about the struggles of the working mom in 2021, about women losing jobs, the economic fallout, and what effects it has on women, all sorts of articles and academic, non-academic, in the press, highlighting the same problem, that this is a recession that has affected women a lot. Now, let me go to how we started working on this project and a more personal motivation. Going back, rewinding for about a little bit less than a year ago, in around April 2020, we are in the start of the pandemic, the first lockdowns, and I sitting there with my colleagues and sometimes talking on the phone or having this kind of short Zoom calls to say hello to each other and saying to each other that this is, there's a surge of economic research. There's a huge amount of papers showing up in our inboxes every day and, in our Twitter feeds, Facebook, this and that. And we didn't really know where it was coming from and how it was happening really, because we could not see ourselves doing this at the time. And of course, we understood why it was going on in some sense, because the pandemic and COVID-19 is a unique opportunity for economists to do research. It's a very interesting phenomenon and a very interesting event that happened that is worth studying as economists. So clearly, there was a lot of curiosity from the perspective of a researcher to explore this. And there was a lot of demand, obviously, for this research to take place, and it had to be done fast because things were happening very quickly at the start of the pandemic. They still do, but even more so at the start. But what was really baffling for us and for my colleagues and myself was how was this happening? Who was doing this economic research that we were seeing flooding in, and we didn't know where it was coming from because we could not really understand how people made time to do this. And I just put this little clipping from my own Facebook feed that I saw around the time in April. This is a post by somebody that is an academic, is a woman academic, married to an academic economist. I don't want to say obviously who the person is, but I thought it was amazing that she wrote this thing, what husband has been up to in the guest bedroom this month, pretty much depicting a lot of very much how a lot of academic couples felt perhaps at the time, that the woman academic is sorting out everything at home, the economist is locked up in a room doing research and writing papers really quickly, right? So I think this is a little bit, saying a bit the story of how we felt at the time. So at that time we thought, maybe, there's something broadly interesting going on in academia, and at the same time, my colleague Elisa Faralia, one of the team here, sent me an email saying, look what I read a few days ago. It was a very interesting column in Nature called The Pandemic and the Female Academic, which was really what started it off for us. And I'm just not going to obviously tell you a lot about this, but just to say that it was a humorous article trying to say that women and mothers that are academics at this time are suffering because they're really trying to keep up with everything, and it's very, very difficult to be able to do research and to keep up with the demands of the lockdowns and the pandemic. So going to what we try to do here, in late April, we try to, we set out to find out who is really doing the research, the economic research, and how. So we came up with this plan of collecting data from repositories of working papers in economics. Maybe I should just say here that in economics, publication process is quite slow. So there was no point at the time to look for publications in economics because papers take a long time from the point of being preprints, essentially, or working papers to being published. So the NBR and the CPR are two sources that are very good sources for this kind of preprints or working papers for economics. And then there was a newly established journal called Covid Economics in March, again, collecting papers that was on COVID research. And there's also VoxEU is a website that has columns that are related to economic research. And we thought that this was a good collection of places where we could look for who is doing this kind of research. And we kind of started working backwards and collected a lot of information of working papers all the way back to 2004. This we did it over the summer later on. Now, what we do here is that we collected and collated manually and by web scraping information on these working papers. And as a start, we started looking at, we focused on authors, the gender of authors, and the academic seniority. And at the beginning, we wanted to say something very specific about these two aspects that are important, obviously, for what we're trying to think about here. But eventually, and when we find more time to continue with this research, we want to explore a lot more aspects of this by looking at maybe subfields, career progression, publication records of authors, family aspects like number of children, ages, co-authorship networks, perhaps all sorts of things one can look at here. But it's quite difficult to compile this data set in a nice, useful way. It's been a little bit slow, the process. So let me just go very quickly over these. These are different things that we're collecting, and we have some already sorted, but others that we are still collecting and trying to put together. But it will give us a list of demographic components, elements, as well as elements of academic career and progression for academic economists and others. And eventually, we also hope to complement all this with a survey that we will send out to all our listed authors. And we had some very early results presented in May in a column for VoxEU, this website that publishes economic columns, under the title, "Who is doing new research in the time of COVID-19? Not the female economist," was our answer. This was published in the 2nd of May, and this was based on analysis that we did manually, essentially, at that period, for data only that included January to April 2020, so the first 4 months of 2020. So the key findings from that early analysis were very important, 3 key points: that generally the production of working papers for NBR and CPR, that are the 2 main repositories for working papers / preprints for economics, increased a lot by about 30% relative to the past years in January to April 2020. Second, and very important, which is somehow comforting, but there's a caveat behind it, is that women's contributions to non-COVID research remained comparable to previous years. What we had as research going on in the past 5 years before that. Now, the caveat here is that comparable means that women authors were participating in papers that were written and deposited in NBR and CPR in this period that were not related to COVID, but usually research that is at the point in time that is deposited in these sources, in these repositories, has already, most of the research has taken place, is not work that is being done currently. Okay, so if somebody deposits a paper in NBR or CPR, let's say in February, is most likely that this actual work took place months before, and at the build-up of depositing it, people just write up, right? So just because the research remained comparable to previous years, it doesn't mean that women necessarily were doing a lot of work in these months. And it's important to highlight this because when you look at related research to COVID-19, to the pandemic, which was the new thing that people were working on very, very actively and very intensively in the first few months of 2020, women contributed a lot less. That's what we found, that the contribution of women authors to COVID research, which was the thing that was going on in the background in February, March, April 2020, the contribution of women was very small in relative terms. Right, so where we are now, unfortunately, we haven't done as much progress as we would have liked to or would have wanted to, but it's kind of, it's almost funny to say that we have been slowed down by lockdown 2 and especially lockdown 3 in the UK that saw the schools closing. In fact, today is the day that the schools opened again. So it's eerily quiet at home here, and it's kind of funny for me to feel that any moment a child might barge in to interrupt me, but it's not going to happen. Gladly, they're at school today. But nevertheless, we have managed to do some progress, and we have processed all the papers from the NBR and CPR from the beginning of the time that we started collecting, 2004, all the way to 2020, October. And we still have to process the data that comes from November, December, January, February, and March now to close the period. We have the data, but we haven't processed it yet. And of course, we haven't completely processed the data from COVID Economics and the Vox EU, but we have some things to show today based on this data set. So with this sub part of the data set, we have approximately 26,000 distinct working papers between 2004 and 2020 in these two sources, and approximately 19,000 distinct authors listed. So we have some nice patterns that emerge from this first analysis. And let me show you a couple of slides with some statistics, and then how we interpret this and what we make out of these slides, out of these results. So this first graph shows you the number of papers combined for NBR and CPR research. These are distinct papers, and they go year per year, right? So what we see, and this is, so just to say that 2020 does not include the COVID papers yet. And here we also go up to October 2020, it's not all the year. But what you can see is that if you just look at it from this perspective, yes, there is kind of a flat area in the first part, but then it starts increasing, and there's an increasing trend of contributions. And I think this is perhaps because NBR and CPR increased their membership as well, to some extent. We don't know exactly how much of that is true until we check carefully, but to some extent, this increase comes from there. And there is an increase in the number of papers that were non-COVID related in 2020. But when I add to that the number of COVID papers on top, the increase is very sharp. The non-COVID research follows somewhat the trend of the previous years, perhaps a little bit more, but the addition of the COVID research shows a very, very big increase in total research over compared to the past years. And if you wonder how much is this specifically, this is 386 papers, distinct papers up until October 2020, written on COVID-19 by economists. And if that doesn't mean much in kind of absolute terms, I think the relative numbers are more impressive in some sense, because this shows you the number of papers that were written related to COVID and sent out week by week by CPR and NBR. And you see that around the middle of the first year of the pandemic, May, June, July, the summer months, about 30% or more, 35% of papers that were deposited in these repositories were related to COVID, which is a very substantial relative amount of research if you think about the total body of economics as a research field that includes a lot of things, right? Economics is a very, very big subject overall. So going to the statistics by gender, which is what we're interested in specifically. So let me plot here. I show you authors now per year by gender, just to make sure, be careful to explain here that these are not distinct authors. Is that if I take a year, any given year, say 2013, and I look at this number, there are a specific number of papers deposited in CPR and NBR, and then we take out the names of the authors, and sometimes a person might write more than one paper, but then we count how many of these are men or women. And sometimes the people might be counted more than once. But importantly, what I want you to take out of this, first of all, clearly, and that's something that we know, is a known fact that men doing economics is a much bigger fraction than of the total research than women. So the orange bars show you the women, but there is an increasing, again, in the increase in the trend is because we have more people writing, perhaps the membership has increased. And then what you see is that in relative terms, these bars look bigger, the orange ones, but proportionally to the overall fraction of research is rather stable. There's been a bit of an increase in more recent years, but it's kind of stable. Now, these are non-COVID research, of course, up to 2020, and I haven't included the COVID research here yet. Once you put the COVID research, you have additionally, this is the fraction, this is the amount of men doing COVID research, and a tiny little yellow block of a few women working on COVID research in 2020. And I guess perhaps this is the most striking comparison one can do is there's a quite substantial block of work being done in COVID for COVID in economics, but a small part of it is done by women. And we can plot the same thing by looking at total fraction of women to total authors per year. This here would capture, and of course, again, highlighting that this is up to 2020 October, not all the way to the end. And what you see here is that there's a decline in the share of women doing research per year in 2020. And interestingly, there's another interesting aspect around here, 2008 and 2009, which was the financial crisis, another occasion where economic research was, seen differently, perhaps. But the dip that we see here for women is down because men increased, while in these situations here is because in 2008, less men were doing research. So it's a kind of a different breakdown, if you want. So this is one thing we take out, that women seem to not, to generally keep up with doing their research, but not as much as women have done. And if we look at breakdowns by seniority, I just want to show you a couple of slides with some numbers here to say that if we look at breakdowns by academic seniority, focusing really on this part essentially, right? Junior, mid-career, senior, these are smaller groups. You see that, for example, mid-career women compared to the other groups is a much, much smaller contributor. Same for men, but in proportion, not so much. And we also look at shares of women within a seniority group or within their own gender to highlight, to take out from here who has done more or less research related to COVID, right? So I have two numbers to highlight here. One is the mid-career women out of, as a share of their seniority group, which means that if I take all mid-career academics in economics, about 60% of them are mid-career women. And within the same gender, if I take all the seniorities and I look at women across all seniorities, a very low percentage, 11.5% are women. And you can look at these numbers in different ways and see that essentially that junior and mid-career women seem to be doing less COVID research than others, while senior and PhD women are doing more. You can look at it from the perspective of comparing within the gender. Whichever way you look at this, the story that comes out of this picture is that women do less COVID research, and especially the junior and the mid-career women seem to be suffering most, which is actually in line with what we have thought at the start of this research project. Now, I think I'm not going to bore you a lot with the driving factors. We have hypotheses here that make complete sense, perhaps, if somebody has experienced all this. Women tend to have higher parental home production and more admin roles in their work environment, especially exacerbated by lockdowns. And if people have young children, I mean, this has been particularly important, especially when the schools have been closed. What is specific for economics and important to keep in mind is that for economists, COVID is a research topic that is new, so it's riskier, right? So if somebody has a little bit of time to do new things, perhaps is not so inclined to take new risky topics. And women tend to be more risk averse when it comes to doing academic research, and this might explain why they haven't taken up this new topic. Right, so I'm closing roughly here by saying that there are a lot of studies that do similar analysis related to what we do, and they find similar results across different disciplines, not only economics. But I think what is especially interesting for economics, as I mentioned, is that because it's a topic, COVID has been a topic that is new for economic research, is a way of maybe perhaps also exploring more work patterns and research patterns of women versus men. So just as a kind of a couple of closing thoughts of what can we do if there is a problem that we need to address here, I think we can all say with certain confidence that there will be scarring effects on academics' long-term careers after COVID. There's no doubt about that. And we still have an open question of what will academic institutions and universities do to respond to this. I think probably Colin has a lot more to say on this than I do, but I would just bring in 2 points here that I wanted to highlight, that we know from research that has been done on that, economic research, in fact, that gender-blind policies for promotions, for example, they don't seem to work very well. There's this paper explaining that whenever there were, for example, men and women equally given stopping their tenure clock because of family issues like paternity or maternity leave, women use the time to look after their children while men use the time to write papers. So it doesn't work the same way for women and men, these kind of policies. Also going to the Athena SWAN process that at least we know that in the UK has partly helped to close the gender gap in STEM, but we also know that it does increase the admin burden for women. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's not clear whether it's very helpful or it is actually causing the opposite problems. And I'm going to close with a couple of comments saying that, you know, generally we need to think about policies that help perhaps more fragile groups like younger women academics that need more guidance. And thank you all here by saying that if you want to have a look at our research, this is our website for project paper. And thank you very much, and sorry for running a bit late.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. That was really fascinating. And that reflexive piece that the research itself has been interrupted by lockdowns 2 and 3 is I think very interesting as well. And you've both covered the data, but also some of the suggestions as to what's to be done. There's a few questions on the Q&A. I might just put a couple of these to you if I may. Very interesting findings. Do you yet have a breakdown of data comparing women with children at home and women with no children?
So this I don't have an answer yet, but we hope to have an answer because we're in the process of collecting information for that. The way we collected the data set is by scraping information publicly available from the internet, from CVs of academics, etc. So the number of children is not there most of the times. But we're planning to run a survey that we will send to academics that we have in our list and hope that many of them will answer and we'll have a proxy for number of children there.
Right. That's an interesting question. What is the impact of women not conducting COVID research if that field is being dominated by male economists?
Sorry, can I hear the question again?
What is the impact of women not conducting COVID research, leaving the field of COVID research dominated by male economists?
I guess that I think that what we can say is that we want to see a little bit what happens over time. I mean, again, I don't want to say too much because we haven't finished analyzing the results, but we have seen women picking up and trying to contribute to COVID research in later months. I don't have this confirmed yet.
Okay. And someone asks, what's the funding landscape like for research on the impact of COVID-19 on gender?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I hope that there will be funding opportunities. I do know that there are funding bodies that offer grants specific to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And there has been opportunities, but specific to the gender impacts, I don't know the answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a question that I think you addressed in your latter slides. You know, what should universities be doing to address the comparative fall-off in productivity for women as a result of COVID? And is there more you want to say about that in terms of supporting career progression?
I guess that I would say generally that I think there have to be some policies implemented in a more systematic way, not just small bits and pieces here and there in a decentralized and ad hoc way. It would be nice to see some policies run in a centralized, organized way that say that if certain demographic groups have been affected more, then they need more help one way or another. But
thanks. Well, certainly we're working on that here in UCD, and of course having the data from your research and more data as it comes from your research will be very helpful in underpinning the kind of policies that we need to adopt. I think we'll need to stop there, but thank you very much indeed for your and for answering the questions. And we will move on to our second speaker. So I'm delighted today to welcome Dr. Ianna Lattu, who's a senior lecturer in social psychology at Queen's University Belfast. Dr. Lattu's research focuses on understanding and reducing intergroup biases, with a specific focus on gender biases in organizational and academic contexts. Her current research, funded by an EPSRC Inclusion Matters grant, seeks to understand and reduce potentially negative attitudes towards gender equality initiatives in STEM fields. Dr. Lattu is also a SWAN champion in the School of Psychology at Queen's University Belfast, a school which renewed its Gold Award in 2017. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Lattu to address us today on her findings from research on gender and COVID-19.
Thanks so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Let me know if it all works. Hopefully you can see everything okay.
Yep, that's good. We've got it. Yep, we've got it.
And I'm just going to minimize myself because it's not good to see myself in these. So thank you again. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. It's really an honor to be invited. And, you know, it was really interesting to hear Chris's research. We've actually looked at her research before and cited it as we were planning our own research. So it's kind of nice to see this and see the motivations behind it. So I look forward to also the discussion after this. So as you mentioned, I am a social psychologist, and I've been interested in understanding the gendered effect of the pandemic. And I have started conducted some research in this area, which I will talk about today. So I want to start answering this question: what challenges does COVID pose on gender equality in higher education and research? By focusing on a principle which has been supported by data in many fields. And this principle is that crises generally tend to deepen existing inequalities. So if there is an existing disparity, whether it's economical, whether it's health related in jobs or pay, a crisis such as a global health crisis or economic crisis is likely to deepen that inequality or enlarge the existing gap. And this is not only about gender, but also, as you mentioned before, racial, ethnic inequalities, class inequalities, and so on. And in fact, I need to mention here that I will mostly talk about gender inequalities focused on women and men, but other types of inequalities are especially important to consider, as we know that intersectionality plays such an important role. Now, if a pandemic is likely to deepen inequalities, gender inequalities, what were they before the pandemic? So even before the pandemic, the division of household work was largely imbalanced, with women conducting more domestic chores and contributing more to childcare compared to men. And this pattern holds even among women who earn more than their partners, earning housework the name of the second shift. So what happened to that second shift? You know, the work women do after they get home from work during the pandemic, when most of us started working from home. So there's quite a bit of research around this, and it suggests that while fathers have taken on more responsibility at home than pre-pandemic, so they are doing more than before, mothers were still shouldering most of the housework and childcare, and their responsibilities increased during the pandemic. This pattern, this gender imbalance, has been found across a number of countries, such as the UK, Germany, the US, and the US. Mothers with young children reduced their paid work hours approximately 5 times more than fathers to meet their increased domestic demands. We also know that mothers were significantly more likely to spend their work hours simultaneously trying to perform household and caregiving responsibilities. And we know how hard that is to constantly switch roles. And they're combining almost half, 47% of their paid work time with care and household duties, compared to 30% of fathers' paid work time. So the second shift turned into somehow 2 simultaneous shifts that we're doing. And of course, this all comes with mental health costs, and there is some research around that, including loneliness, isolation, stress, and burnout. And research across several countries, such as the UK, Turkey, China, shows that the costs for women's mental health are higher than those for men's. So we saw that women are doing more than before in terms of childcare, elder care, housework, and their mental health is suffering. But what about their academic productivity? Well, as Chrissy discussed in detail, the answer is yes. Overall, what the research shows is that women academics bear a greater burden during the pandemic. And there's evidence from many fields, again, as Chrissy mentioned, so I won't go into detail about this slide. We've cited her research here actually too, but we see across STEM fields, social sciences, that women's research productivity has decreased compared to men. And some studies are showing that this seems to be especially the case for early career researchers, but we see that this is happening at every step. So what can we do about this? And this is where I get to the research that we've been doing here. So I want to share the approach that we've taken at Queen's. Under the leadership of the Queen's Gender Initiative, which is a university-wide gender equality initiative that sort of coordinates all our efforts within the individual schools. And Professor Karen McCloskey, who is the head of the university-wide initiative of QGI, or Queen's Gender Initiative. So this project is called Engendering Solutions to the Lockdown Effect, and has had several stages. So last summer, in the first stage, the QGI initiated several conversations, one with SWAN champions, or several with SWAN champions, with female academic staff in general, with female technical staff, to understand the issues we're facing and explore solutions. So it was a more qualitative approach to this, where we just had conversations about it. And then in the second stage, which we're in now, so to say, we've designed an actual survey for all Queen's staff. And we've looked at both academic and professional services staff, but I'll just present the data for academics for the purpose of, just being shorter with this presentation. And this was with the support of Human Resources, the organizational development team. So we've gotten responses from around 1,500 staff members, including professional staff, professional services staff members. And our goal was to answer 4 main questions. So first, does the lockdown, has it caused a gendered impact on workload and productivity? What's the lived-in experience, including housework and caring responsibilities, work-family conflict, burnout, and career motivations? And then we've also explored potential solutions to mitigate those effects and any positive learnings from the pandemic. For example, how can we maintain flexible working practices? So as you see, the survey covered all areas of the lived experience of Queen's staff. So we wanted to look not only at research productivity, but also at staff's academics' daily routines, commitments, their well-being, their career motivations, and so on. So this is, we think, a more holistic approach than what we've seen before, that allowed us to formulate then recommendations, which we brought to the University Executive Board. And those recommendations are more general and take into account all aspects of staff's work and life. And I think another aspect that I think makes our approach valuable is that the effort, and Chrissy mentioned this a little bit, was centralized. So it was driven by academics to do research in this area, such as myself, and academics' needs, but also supported by the central university initiatives, such as the Queen's Gender Initiative. And we had the HR organizational development team support. And this all gave us the leverage to propose solutions to the University Executive Board that were much more likely to be taken into account. So we're at the stage now where we propose those solutions. So I don't want to share, all of the data. We have quite a bit of data from this, just a few highlights to give you an idea of the findings. And they sort of map on to what Chrissy was showing earlier and what the field is showing. We've just put them together in the next few slides. So again, we first wanted to understand how the lives of our staff looked like during the first few months of the pandemic. So we first asked staff how much time they spent on several activities, and we report data separately for academics, those on research and education and on education-only paths, and for research fellows, because as you'll see, they have quite a bit of different experiences because of the teaching commitments. So here on the y-axis, you see the percentage that people spent on each activity, which is work, caregiving, housework, hobbies, and exercise. And you can see data for female academics in red, for male academics in blue, and for all academics, so bunched together in gray. And what we observe is that academics spent on average around 55% of their day during lockdown on work, followed by caregiving and housework, with very little time spent left for hobbies or exercising. And female academics tended to spend a larger proportion of their day on caregiving compared to men. There was a significant difference there, whereas men, there's a tendency to spend more time on housework and hobbies compared to women. A similar pattern was found for researchers, so research fellows, postdocs who spent about half of their day working. Also, female research fellows spend more time on caregiving compared to male research fellows. Oftentimes, this coincides with the age when they have small children, so that sort of accounts for this, although we've seen it for academics too. But how do these data compare to before the pandemic? So we asked them, how did it look like during the first lockdown, but also what did your day look like before the lockdown? So a year ago, and looking on the graph and on the left, both male and female academics spent a higher proportion of their day on caregiving responsibilities during compared to before the pandemic lockdown, with female academics performing an especially large percentage of caregiving. And the graph on the right suggests that while caregiving responsibilities increased, work time has stayed high during compared to before the lockdown, suggesting that many academics, especially women, work those double shifts or simultaneous shifts with very little time left for other activities such as hobbies and exercising, which we'll see have a cost for their mental health. A similar pattern for caregiving was reported for researchers. However, they also reported that time spent on work has decreased for them during the pandemic. So after getting a glimpse of their overall day, we also wanted to see how staff divided their time across several work tasks. So now what do they do when they work? Depending on their profiles. So here we see that academics, both on research education and education-only paths, spend most of their time on teaching and learning tasks, followed by research, citizenship, and COVID-related admin. Research fellows spend most of their time on research and scholarship, with no notable gender differences there. Participants were also asked about their research publications and grants. I'm just presenting the data on publications here. The majority of academics and researchers reported that their paper submission has decreased, but the impact was certainly higher on women than men. While this difference may seem small here, we know that the accumulation of micro disadvantages is known to negatively impact careers long term. Paper submissions planned for the start of the academic year were lower again, suggesting once again that the women were more impacted. Then a key focus of the survey was staff's well-being. So we asked staff to what extent they felt tired, depressed, physically unwell, and to what extent they experienced feelings of failure and difficulty sleeping. And these all are items that measure burnout in psychological research. And what we see is that academics, especially female academics, felt very tired, with average scores well above the midpoint of the scale, which was 3.5. Many also experienced feelings of failure and difficulty sleeping, with women reporting higher scores compared to men. Research fellows also reported feeling tired, female researchers reporting higher scores for tired and physically unwell compared to male researchers. Now, how have these challenges affected staff's motivations and career aspirations? Well, despite these challenges, and you see here the professional services staff, you can sort of put that to the side. Despite these challenges, the majority of our staff feel highly motivated to progress in their careers, with female academics reporting the highest levels of motivation. So that's the big red bar there on the left. So overall, what our findings show is that staff experience lots of challenges during this pandemic. They spend most of their days on working and caregiving tasks with very little time left for anything that would help their mental health. They spend a lot of time on teaching and learning, with costs on their research productivity and well-being. And these patterns, although we see them for both male and female staff or academics, they're especially accentuated for women. So we think that they will have sort of ripple effects into the future, accumulating over time. Now, what we've done with these data is that we've sent a full survey report we've presented it to the University Executive Board, along with recommendations that we've drawn out of these. And now an action plan is being drawn up to provide solutions that will mitigate this lockdown effect. I'm happy to talk about it more if you want in the Q&As. But these are around workload, promotion processes, remote and flexible working, increasing staff well-being, and so on. And we're also preparing these findings for publication, of course, because we want to get out there sort of how we went about making those recommendations. And we hope that this gives a glimpse about our sort of evidence-based approach to addressing the impact of the pandemic on our university's staff through a gendered lens that we've taken thanks to the Queen's Gender Initiative. So maybe I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you very much, Ianna. I was particularly interested that in this research, you've managed to embed yourself fully in the structures of the university. So you've worked with HR, you've worked with the Queen's Gender Initiative, both to build, I suppose, the support for the research you've done, but also then to build the support in the executive board for the findings of the research. And that seems to be a fantastic lesson for other universities such as ours as to how to engage our research capacity with our practical actions to address the challenges that have raised. We've lots of questions coming in. Someone asks, have mental health supports in Queen's to staff increased over the period?
Yes, I think it did. So there are quite a lot of initiatives to support mental health and well-being. I think in the last few months, our faculty has developed programs around that, training people on how to address mental health issues. And there's also, I think what's important to do is, look at the workload because, we can do extra training and extra activities, and those are helpful, but also just reducing the workload and sort of managing meetings and all of that is important. So we've made some proposals and recommendations around that of having support for that.
Thank you. We've certainly been asking in my own area, what can we defer, what can we cancel that would reduce loads. Another question here is, in the work you did with the Executive Board in Queen's, what type of actions around promotions are being proposed to support women's career progression?
Yeah, so the promotion process was just launched, and our recommendation around that was that through the application process, staff can write a cover letter explaining the effects of COVID on their productivity, for example, and that committees or panels who evaluate those also answer, once they make a decision, sort of become accountable for, have they taken into account the impact of COVID on that. So that has actually gone out, and now everybody gets the opportunity, if they wanted, to write a cover letter explaining the effect of COVID, and there's clear recommendations that those should be taken into account, whether it's about closing labs or caregiving responsibility. So there's sort of a very general, very explicit message that these should be taken into account, and panels are trained. We've also, we have SWAN champions on promotion panels. So that's the recommendation for our processes, to have on each panel have a SWAN champion, either from the school, or if there's no eligible one from the school, from other schools. And the QGI is doing a training with us on what to look for, as SWAN champions, as representatives of gender equality when we're on the panel. So that should be helpful for us to know how to approach these when we're actually there.
Can I ask, did you make any recommendations around careers and promotions or progression for professional and administrative staff affected by COVID?
Let me think. I can't think of them. So yes, we've definitely taken that into account. Their productivity was not hit as hard as it was for academic staff. So they were, most of them, except for those sort of operational services, you know, the people who worked on campus and had to be there, they were able to continue their work at home. But there is definitely coaching available and, you know, other programs, but we didn't see effects that were so you know, so large as they were for academic staff.
Right. Then someone interested in the effects on exercise, he noted that male academics are doing more exercise in the pandemic than female academics. Is there a psychological explanation for that?
I don't know. You know, we don't. All we have is are those data. It seems, I think there's just sort of a give and take, right? If women spend more time on homeschooling and caregiving responsibilities, they do have less time for going out and exercising. Also, we see that women spend more time, for some of them, on teaching, and you know, that certainly takes a lot of time. So I think it's just maybe having less time for that, you know, because they're doing other stuff such as caregiving. But it definitely shows then into the mental health costs, you know, with women feeling more tired, feeling more low.
Thanks. Just a last question then. You mentioned the pandemic magnified existing inequalities. Is there a push towards more sustainable changes in gender equality and inclusion coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's the big question, and I think that's our biggest opportunity when doing this kind of research. I think there are lessons that we can take, you know, sort of positive learnings from this, such as allowing for flexible work, because a lot of our female staff members were quite happy about this, you know, being able to work more flexibly. So what I did mention is that we've also asked open-ended questions where people could talk about, you know, positive learnings and sort of like what recommendations they would have or what solutions they would propose. And a lot of this has come out. You know, academic staff, especially women, have been happier with being able to work flexibly. So I think that's one of them, but the rest is still, I think, something that we could explore based on the situation.
Thank you. It's fascinating research, and I think very important. I hope we will stay in contact with your research at UCD, because there's much we can learn from it, both in terms of the response to the pandemic, but also the embedding of research capacity into the making of policy making to address key equality challenges in this way. So thanks so much for the presentation and for answering the questions. Could I reiterate thanks also to Chrissy for her presentation earlier. I think we've had two outstanding presentations today. And it's really a great start to our week of International Women's Days events here at UCD, and it's emblematic really of linking research capacity to understanding of the challenges we face ourselves, which is a difficult thing to do, I think, and you both are very much exemplars of the capacity to investigate ourselves, understand better our own challenges, provide evidence, and which makes it which supports then appropriate policies to address the challenges that you identify. So could I thank you both very warmly from UCD. Perhaps next time we'll be able to do it in the room rather on Zoom, but it's been wonderful to have you here on Zoom today, and thank you to all the people who've been on the webinar. Thanks to everyone who's put in questions. I wish everyone a happy International Women's Day, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.